So, good morning. Today's daf is Kaf Gimel. We're going to start on the top of Kaf Gimel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines down from the top because we finished off with the sugya. We finished off with the piece from the previous daf that ended about 12 lines down on Kaf Gimel Amud Aleph. Amar Rav Sheshet says, Achsenai chayav b'ner Chanukah. A guest is obligated in Ner Chanukah, which means that if you're visiting somebody else's home, even though the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah relates to the home, so you might think that if you're not in your home, you can't really fulfill the mitzvah because it has to be either at the door or it has to be on the table, but it's related to a home. So you might think that if you're living somewhere else in somebody else's place, you wouldn't be doing the Ner Chanukah. The answer is that you're still obligated to do so. Amar Rabbi Zera said, Meresh ki havenda berav. When I used to live in the yeshiva. In other words, when I used to live, they used to host him somewhere in the neighborhood, like the way that they used to do. When you would go away to yeshiva, you would stay with the family. Yeah, you would stay with the family or whatever. You would have hospitality. So there, mishtatafna b'prite. I would join together with a pruta, which means to say, that's actually what the halacha is, that if you're staying in somebody's house, you're allowed to give them a little bit of money towards the candles or towards the oil, and that's how you participate in the mitzvah. So he said, that's what I used to do. But now, he says, together with my host. That's what I would do. But after I got married, itita to a woman. So once I got married, Amina, I said, now I definitely do not need to join together. In other words, wherever I'm staying. So even after he was married, he would sometimes go away to the yeshiva and he would stay with some hospitality. So now I don't need to participate with my host anymore because in my house they're already lighting for me. And that's really what the halacha is, that if a person's, let's say, away on a business trip, but their wife is lighting in the house, it's okay, they don't have to do anything. However, if they're single or they don't have anybody at home who's going to be lighting for them, then they have to participate in the mitzvah one way or another in the place that they are. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Kol Shemanim Kulan Yafin Laner, that any kind of oil is really good for the ner, for the candle. V'shemen zayit min hamufchan, but it happens to be that olive oil is the best. Amar Abai says, Meresh hava mehader mar am mishcha dishum shemeh. In the beginning, my teacher, who was Rabbi Bar Nachmani, in the beginning, my teacher used to look for sesame oil. Amar hay mashach nehorei tefeh, because he said this is the type of oil that is drawn to the wick most readily, so therefore it's the most sustainable flame. Kevan d'shamala lahad Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, but after he heard what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, that olive oil is the best, mehader am mishcha d'zeta, he started looking for olive oil. Amar hay tzalil nehorei tefeh, because even though sesame oil has the advantage that it's drawn after the wick more readily, the olive oil has a brighter flame. The flame is a cleaner flame, and it's true. If you look at the flame on an oil chanukah of olive oil, yeah, it's really beautiful. So Avam Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Kol Shemanim. Now this has nothing directly to do with our sugya, except that it mentions oil. And it's stated by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Kol Shemanim Yafin Ledio. All oils are good for making ink. V'shemen zayit min hamufchar, but olive oil is the best. Now, what did they do? They used to burn oil. What they would do is they would take a glass and they would suspend it over burning oil. The soot from the burning oil would collect on the glass, and then they would scrape it off. And then they would mix it with they would mix it with oil and make a kind of blackened oil, and then they would put that with the rest of the with the rest of the ingredients for the ink. So the point is that there are two stages of it. Ibailu, they asked the question, legabelo le'ashen, in which respect did you say olive oil was the best? Did you mean that if you want to create the soot, in other words, you're going to burn the olive oil to make the blackened glass, it's preferable to use olive oil for that? Or did you mean that after you collect the soot, it doesn't matter what oil you use to create the blackness, but when you mix it with oil, you should mix it with olive oil when you scrape it off? Which one did you mean? Tashma, come and listen. The Tani Rav Shmuel Bar Zutra, Rav Shmuel Bar Zutra said the following: Kol hashemanim yafin ladio. All oils are good for ink. The shemen zayit min hamufchar ben legabel ben la'ashen. He said for both steps in the process, olive oil is the best. Both for creating the blackness by burning it with the glass suspended above, and for kneading it, so to speak, with the oil, for mixing it with the oil afterwards, so that it makes a black oil that can then be added to the other ingredients. Rav Shmuel Bar Zutra. Matneh Hachi. Rav Shmuel Bar Zutra taught as follows: Kol ha'ashanim yafin ladio. All of the smoky substances, in other words, the substances with which you can make smoke to make this blackness that can be added to the oil, are good for ink. V'shemen zayit ben hamufchar. And shemen zayit, olive oil, is the best. Amar Rav Huna said, Kol hashirafin yafin ladio. All of the sap is best, is good for ink. Ushraf ketaf yafem mikulam. This is what it says. Shraf hayotze me'atzei ketaf that we read about in the Ketoret. Okay, the sap that comes from this tree. I think it's called what is it called? Balsam oil or something. I can't remember what they call it. What they call the
blackthorn gum.
Where what do they say in the I think that's Rashi says it's some kind of gummy substance, but I think that most of the Mefarshim say the other way, that it's the sap of a type of tree. Okay, and it's the sap of a type of tree that was actually also added to the Ketoret. So I forget the name of the tree offhand, but it's a sap of a tree. So he says this is good for burning. Not for burning, for adding to the oil as an ingredient to give it substance. Apparently, they had different stages. They would make the blackness by creating soot and mixing it with oil, and then they would mix it with other substances that gave body to the ink.
So it's more than
the oil. Yeah. So they would end up, and Rashi says it's some kind of gummy, natural gummy substance. And according to Tosafot, it's talking about a sap of a certain tree that's also mentioned in connection with the Ketoret. Okay. Amar Rav Chiya Bar Ashi. Rav Chiya Bar Ashi says, Amar Rav, that Rav says, Hamadlik ner shel Chanukah tzarich levarich, that somebody who lights the ner Chanukah tzarich levarich, he has to say a beracha. For Rav Yirmiyah Amar, and Rav Yirmiyah said, Aro en ner shel Chanukah tzarich levarich, that one who sees the ner Chanukah has to make a blessing. Amar Rav Yudah said, Yom Rishon aro en mevarich shtayim umadlik mevarich shalosh, that on the first day, if you see a candle, but you don't light it. In other words, let's say a person doesn't have a place to stay. So they don't have the means or whatever to light a Chanukiah. So they're not going to be able to light themselves. All they're going to do is see somebody else's candle in the window. So they would say 2 berachot. And the person who lights on the first night says 3 berachot. Mikan velach, after the first night, madlik mevarech shtayim veroem verech achat. After that, if you see the candle, you say 1. If you light the candle, you say 2. Now we're going to explain what this means. Which one do you leave out? You leave out She'achayanu. So on the first night, you say Lahadik Ner Shel Chanukah and She'asa Nisim, and you're going to say She'achayanu. We all know that, right? If you don't light, but you only see a candle, because for some reason you don't have the ability to light. So Rashi says you're traveling on a boat where there's no way to light it, or whatever the case may be, it doesn't matter. So then you would only say She'asa Nisim and She'achayanu on the first night. Obviously you can't say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, the blessing for lighting, if you're not actually lighting. And you would say Shechayanu as well on the first night. On the second night, you would just say Sha'asa Nisim. If all you did was see the candle, you would say Sha'asa Nisim. So there's a discussion about, actually, in the poskim, about what about a blind person. Does this mean that Sha'asa Nisim is really a blessing on seeing the candle? So can a blind person say Sha'asa Nisim? There's a whole discussion about it. Very interesting. V'nim otnes, why instead of leaving out Shechayanu, why don't we say, you know what, each day is like a new holiday. We're saying a full Hallel. It's got a significance all its own. Why don't we say Shechayanu every day and leave out Sha'asa Nisim? We can say Sha'asa Nisim just the first day. We'll say all 3 berachot the first day. And then the other days we'll just say La'adlik Ner Shel Chanukah and we'll say Shechayanu. Why does it have to be that we leave out the Shechayanu? He says, Nes kol yom iteh. The reason is because there was a new miracle every day. Because every day they thought that the candle was going to go out in the Beit HaMikdash, and every day was a miracle. But to reach this time of year, Shechayanu is just one thing. We reached the holiday. So on other holidays, we don't say Shechayanu every day, because once we reach the destination, Ve'egi'anu lazeman hazeh, we reach this time. That's it. So my mivarech, what do we bless? Mivarech, Mivarech Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu ladik ner shel Chanukah. We say the blessing, Hashem commanded us, sanctified us with His commandments, and commanded us to light the candle of Chanukah. Ve'hechan tzivan. Where do we see that God commanded us to light a Chanukah candle? Did God command us about Chanukah in the Torah? Obviously not. It happened a lot later than the Torah. It's not written in the Torah. Rav Avya says, Milot Asur. This is the most famous source that's brought for making blessings on all rabbinic commandments. How can we make a blessing on a rabbinic commandment? On reading the Megillah, on lighting Shabbat candles, on any mitzvah midirabanan, any rabbinical commandment. How can we say, God, you sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to do this? So Rav Avya says, Milot Tasur, because it says in the Torah, Lo Tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yaminu smol. Don't deviate from what the rabbis tell you, left or right or left. So what that means is, if they give you a commandment, God commands you to do it. He didn't directly, specifically command you to light Ner Chanukah, but He did command you to listen to the authority of the sages, and the sages commanded you to light the Chanukah candle. So although it's indirect, still it's true. Rav Nechemia says, this is a pasuk from Ha'azinu. It says, ask your father and he will tell you. Your elders and they will tell you. So in other words, what it means is, what your elders tell you and what your parents tell you, you should do. So there's a positive command or a positive message from the Torah, a commandment from the Torah, that we have to listen to the traditions that come down to us from our elders and our parents. And although this is more of a positive injunction, basically. It's not saying Lo Tasur, don't deviate from what the rabbis tell you, but it's telling you, listen to your elders, listen to the Zikanim, listen to what they tell you. So it's more of a positive command. Either way you slice it, the point is that while it doesn't directly say in the Torah anything about these rabbinical commandments, such as lighting Shabbat candles or Chanukah candles, still, because the Torah tells us that we are supposed to abide by the teachings of the sages, either because it tells us not to deviate from them, or because it says listen to them, whatever the bottom line is, we're supposed to follow them. And therefore we can say, that Hashem commanded us to do this, albeit indirectly. Mativ Rav Amram raised an objection. Had Dimai. What is Dimai? Dimai literally means, what is this? Dimai. What is it? Now, what is it? What's the concept here? Basically, it has to do with Maser. Terumah, even the Amei Aretz, even the ignoramuses were very careful about separating Terumah. Because if you don't separate Terumah and you eat the food, it's karet. It's a very serious and severe penalty. So they were very particular about that. But Ma'aser, it doesn't really have holiness. The Ma'aser for the Levi. So you would separate it, and you would give it to the Levi, and the Levi could invite you over to eat it. It didn't have any Kedusha. It was just the property of the Levi. So people didn't see it as being that serious. So they were less meticulous about separating the Ma'aser. Also, it was more. It's a whole tenth of the produce. So it was a significant investment. So it was significant tax, I guess you could say. So what the rabbis did was they said, we're a little concerned that the Amei Aretz are not careful about separating Maser. So when you purchase produce from an Amei Aretz, from one of the average people, you have to separate what's called Dimai. Out of doubt, you have to separate this Maser, but then you don't have to get rid of it. You don't have to give it to the Levi. You can keep it, but you have to separate it. So that's what it says here is, Hademai me'arevin bo, you can use it for the eruv. Remember, we talked about eruvei techumin, which allows a person to extend the distance that they can walk on Shabbat by placing it 2,000 damot outside of the city limits. Then you get an extra 2,000 damot you're allowed to walk. Or there's also eruvei chatzerot, which means within a chatzer, within a courtyard. If people want to carry in the courtyard, it's an enclosed place, but it's a shared space. So they have to make something called eruvei chatzerot. It also says umishtatvin bo. This is talking about mavuot. Mavuot are the alleyways in between courtyards. Again, because they're shared space. Even though biblically you're allowed to carry in them because they're enclosed, since they're a shared space, they had to do something called shituf mavuot, which is partnership, that all the members of the different courtyards that share that alleyway join together and use bread. Again, they use bread, put it in one of the courtyards and say, this belongs to all of us, we're all part of one big family. The same idea of eruvei chatzerot, that everybody in the courtyard would say, we're all one big family, so our shared space is all one space. So you can use the demai to do that. Even though this is, in a way, you might think of it as Ma'aser, because you separated it to satisfy the obligation out of the doubt of Ma'aser. But you can still utilize it. Umivarachin alav, you can eat it and say a blessing on it. Umizamnin alav, if you ate it, you can say Birkat Hamazon. It's not considered a sin to consume it, because basically the way we look at it is, you separated it, but now we say Hamotzi mechavero alav araya. If the Levi wants to claim it, prove that it belongs to him. He has to prove it. Right? So I fulfilled my obligation vis-a-vis Hashem by separating it. But monetarily, now that Maaser doesn't have any holiness. So now it's a monetary question. The Levi can come and say, I want that Maaser, you separated it as Maaser. I can say, prove that it's really Maaser, prove that the person I bought this produce from didn't separate Maaser, and I'll give it to you. But if the Levi can't prove it, he can't take it, so you get to keep it. So basically what happens is, ritually you separated the Maaser, but from a civil law standpoint, from Dinei Mamonot, you get to keep it. So that's the way it works. So, and then he says, Umafrishino to Arum, you can be naked when you separate the maaser, which basically means you don't say a blessing. Because if you had to say a blessing on separating the maaser, you have to be clothed, obviously. So what that's a way of saying is, you don't have to say a blessing because you're only separating it out of doubt. You're not separating it as a definite. And as we know from the Mishnah and Bameh Madlikin, you can separate demai during Ben HaShemashot. That's what it says. In the when we read Bameh Madlikin every Friday, it mentions the things you can do in Ben HaShemashot, the things that you can do just when Shabbat has started. It says there's certain things you cannot do, like you can't light the candle, etc. But you can separate the demai, because since the demai, we don't really know that it's definitely a separating of maaser. So we're lenient, and we say that even once Shabbat has started, you can do it. You can separate it. During Ben HaShemashot, when it's definitely Shabbat, you can't. But in that twilight period between sunset and when the stars come out, rabbinical commandments are not enforced. So rabbinical restrictions are not enforced. So therefore you can separate the demai during that time. But what's the reason why we brought this idea about demai up? Because you're telling me that on rabbinical commandments we say a blessing. But But if that's the case, then demai should also require a blessing, because it's a rabbinical requirement that you separate this doubtful maaser. So why don't you have to say a beracha? How can you do it naked? Answer. It's still building the question. We need kadosh, that your camp should be holy, meaning you should always conduct yourself with proper dignity, and that means you have to be, when you say Hashem's name, you have to have your private parts covered. Veleka, and you wouldn't have it here if you're separating this maaser naked. So how can you say the beracha? Obviously, what must we conclude? You don't say a beracha on separating demai. And if you don't say a beracha on separating demai, why are you saying a beracha on lighting the Chanukiah? Doesn't make any sense. Amar Abaye says, Vadai didivrehem ba'e beracha. When it's a definite commandment that the rabbis told you must do X or you must do Y, such as lighting the Chanukiah, such as shaking the lulav after the first day of Sukkot, the remaining days of Sukkot. It's also dirabanan. All of these things that the rabbis said they said you must do this. There we say a bracha. However, safek de divrehem lo ba'i bracha. But when all they're doing is telling you it's a doubt, the rabbis didn't come along and say, we're creating a new mitzvah, that you need to separate maaser when you buy produce from an ignoramus, from an average person. That's not what they said. What they said was, we're not sure what the status of this maaser is, so therefore, based on principles of doubt, you have to separate. That's not the same as making a commandment, where they said, we're creating an institution that you are going to shake the lulav all the days of Sukkot, not just the first day. It's not a doubt, they just told you to do it. On Chanukah, it's not a doubt. They're telling you, here's a commandment, light the Chanukiah.
So were they telling them to separate them?
So here they're telling you, but they're telling you it out of doubt. They're saying, because there's a doubt here, you need to cover your bases. But they're not creating a new rabbinical commandment. Right.
From produce from Amharites.
Right.
What's the consequence?
There's no real consequence. I mean, you didn't abide by the rules. You didn't play by the rules. But basically, it's not that they created a mitzvah out of whole cloth and they commanded you to do it. They were calculating the level of doubt and saying, because we're not sure, you have to treat it this way. But it's just an application of a principle. It's not really a new mitzvah. Okay, so then they asked an obvious question here. Vayom tov sheni, the safek divrayhem. What about Yom Tov Sheni, the second day of Yom Tov? Why do we do the second day of Yom Tov? Out of doubt. Because we're not sure what the day is. Which day is Yom Tov? And don't you say Kiddush? Don't you say all the blessings of the second day? You sure do. There, There, the reason is because if they created a second day of Yom Tov and you didn't say Berachot, So people wouldn't take it seriously. They would be mizdalzel. They would look at it as insignificant. They wouldn't be careful about observing it if they did it without barachot. Anything we do without a baracha, people lose their sense of the significance of it. I talked about it many times about the Omer. That people miss a day of Sfirat to Omer, they're not supposed to say a baracha, they stop counting, which is totally wrong. Because 99% of the Rishonim hold that you're supposed to actually continue with a baracha. And we're being stringent, telling you not to say the baracha. But instead people don't do the mitzvah. Because they think, I lost it already. So in the same way here, what Abaye is answering is that yes, it's based on a doubt, but if they didn't structure the way that you take care of this doubt with brachot, people wouldn't keep it. And that's why they had to give you brachot as well. Rava comes along and says, Rov amei haaretz me'aserin hen. I disagree. I say that even if there's a safek, even if there's a doubt with respect to a rabbinic commandment, in other words, it's a rabbinically, the rabbis command me to take care of this doubt in a certain way, such as Yom Tov Sheni, the second day of Yom Tov. Or it would be the case with Demai as well. Anytime the rabbis tell me that I have to address a certain doubt, I say, really you would have a bracha, but the only thing is that here, Rov amei haaretz me'aserin hen, most of even the common people do separate maaser. The majority of them do. So really, even under the rules of safek, even under the rules of doubt, we could be lenient here. Because based on majority, the majority of the people do separate the maaser. It's a significant group, but a minority. So because it's a significant group, but a minority, really based on the principles of doubt, we could rule that we wouldn't have to separate demai. You could rely on the majority that the person probably did it. But the rabbis came along and they were extra strict. So apparently, according to Rava, if it were 50-50, that we really didn't know if Maser was separated or not, you would say a bracha on separating Demai. But since it's 75-25, the doubt, let's say, or it's 60-40, or something like that, therefore we say that you shouldn't say a bracha, because really, based on the principles of Safek, you wouldn't be separating it at all. But in the case of Yom Tov, it's 50-50. We don't know what the day is.
And they're worried about commanding a bracha because it might be an
unnecessary one, right? So Rava is taking it a step up. Abaye is saying any time that we're only doing this to resolve a doubt, that the rabbis are telling us to do this to resolve a doubt, we don't say a bracha, except for Yom Tov Sheni. It's the exception. Because they had to institute a bracha, otherwise you wouldn't take it seriously. Rava says no. Even Yom Tov Sheni follows the same rule, that whenever there's a doubt, we do it with a bracha. The only thing is, here it's not really a legitimate doubt about the maaser, because the maaser, most of the people separated anyway. That's how they conclude that. So for Ner Chanukah, for sure, it's a definite commandment given by the rabbis, instituted by the rabbis. No question, we would say a bracha. Now we say Amar Rav Huna says Chatzer sheyesh like bet petachim. If there's a courtyard that has two openings. Now Rashi interprets this to mean that your house has two openings. You have a front door that opens to the courtyard, and your back door also opens to the courtyard. According to Tosafot, the proper place to put your Chanukiah, if you live in a courtyard, is at the door of the courtyard that borders on the public domain. It's a machloket rishonim. There's a machloket about this. So just for simplicity's sake, we'll follow Rashi, who says that what this means is your house opens on two sides to the public area or to the courtyard. Okay? So tzricha shte nerot. You need to have two Chanukiyot. What's the reason? Because apparently people will... So Rava says... so what is the correct text here? He says, what it should say is... Amar, just Amar, okay. So Amar, Rava says, Lo Amaran ela mishtei ruchot, aval miruach achat lo tzarich. That's only if the two openings to the courtyard are on two sides of your house. Okay? What's the reason? Because when people pass by, my tama, what's the reason? Im leima mishum chashada. If you're going to tell me it's because of people suspecting you. In other words, if a person sees only one side of your house, it doesn't have any chanukiyah, he's going to say, this guy's not following the mitzvah. He's only going to see one side. He didn't see the other side of your house. So he's going to assume you didn't do it. So chashda deman, who are we worried about? If you're worried about people from outside, then even if there's one, even if you have only two openings of your house on the same side. Let's say you have two front doors. You have a very large house. You have two front doors. then you should have to have a Chanukiah at both doors. Because if a person isn't from this neighborhood and he sees he sees two front doors, maybe he'll think it's a two-family shared home, and he'll think only one family is doing the mitzvah. He doesn't know. So then it should apply to both cases. It shouldn't matter that the doors are on opposite sides of the house. Even when they're on the same side, it should be a problem. And if you're worried about the suspicions of the people who live in that courtyard, then even on two sides of the house we shouldn't be worried, because everybody in the neighborhood knows that you have two openings of your house, one in the front door, one in the back. So why would there be a concern? Really, it's because of the suspicion of the people who live in the neighborhood. Because they might know that there's, in other words, if you had just two front doors, because you had a large house, they're going to know that only one family lives there, because they live in the neighborhood. But if you had a front entrance and a back entrance, and you only lit the Chanukiah on one of them, then it could be that somebody from the neighborhood only passes by the back of your house. And they say, oh, I don't see a Chanukiah. Obviously, he's slipping, this guy. He's not doing the mitzvah. So therefore, you have to cover both the front and the back. Because they might figure that since they don't see a Chanukiah in the back door, there's also not one in the front door. So therefore, they would have to have both. And where do we know this idea that we're concerned about what people think about us? Why should we worry about what people say? Why should we go out of our way to light another Chanukiah just to avoid chashad, to avoid people suspecting us of wrongdoing? Because we learned in a Braita, and this is about pe'ah. Pe'ah is leaving the corner of your field. When you harvest, you have to leave the corner of the field for poor people to come and take it. So, Amar Rabbi Shimon said, and remember, Rabbi Shimon is famous because Rabbi Shimon is Doresh Ta'amad Dikra. He always analyzes the reason behind mitzvot. So he asked the question, why does the Torah tell you specifically to leave a corner of your field? There are 4 reasons. That the Torah told you to leave the corner at the end of your field. Mipnei Gezel Aniyim, because you're robbing the poor. And what does that mean, you're going to rob the poor? What that means is that, it's going to explain it in a second, so I won't preempt. And because you're going to waste the time of the poor. And because of suspicion. And because of the injunction or the prohibition of finishing off the field. So there are 4 things. We're going to see what each one is. What do you mean you're stealing from the poor if you don't? Why do you have to leave it at the end of your field? Why can't you leave it in the middle of your field? Why does it have to be the end? Because maybe the Balabayit will see that there are no poor people around. The owner is going to see there are no poor people around. And he'll say to his relative who's a poor person, hey, come over. I declare this part of my field pe'ah right now. Take it. In other words, he'll show cronyism. We're worried about cronyism, that you're going to favor. In other words, when you're going to leave it at the end of your field, everybody knows it's going to be at the end of your field, and they all have an equal shot at getting it. But if you could leave it at any time, then you could wait for somebody you like to be around, declare the middle of your field pe'ah when you don't see any other poor people around, and he'll be able to take all of it. We turn to Amud Bet. What does it mean, wasting the time of the poor? Because if they don't know when you're going to leave it, if it's at the end of your harvesting, they know around when to come. They can figure out when to come. Because they see you just started harvesting. They know it's not going to be soon. But if you could leave it at any point, they're going to have to wait around to see when their number is going to be called. It's like going to the MVA. No matter what the number is, what number they're calling, for some reason you always wait an hour. Even if it looks like your number is next. When you first get there, it's still an hour. Because the numbers don't mean anything. Okay, so the same thing, they have to wait. In other words, they have to go in, right? So we don't want them to have to sit around. When is he going to leave it? When is he going to leave it? They know when he's done is when he's going to leave it. So if he just started, they know it's going to be a while. They can come back. And so people don't suspect him. Because people will walk by and say, may a curse come on this person, he didn't leave a corner of his field. And really the person did leave it, but he left it in the middle and people already came and took it. But since at the edge of the field, they don't see at the end of the field a corner left, they're going to assume he didn't do it. So we see from here that we're concerned about people thinking we didn't do mitzvot properly. And then lastly, it says the last reason is because it says in the Torah, don't finish off your field, leave the corner. So the Gemara asks, do you really mean that the fourth reason why he leaves the edge of the field is because the Torah says not to finish off the field. That's just what the Torah says. That's not a reason. That's the commandment. All of these, you're explaining why the Torah says not to finish off your field. How can you say one of the reasons is because the Torah tells you not to finish off your field? That's saying the reason that you do it is because you don't do it. That's not a reason. Amar Rava says what it means is mipnei rama'in, because of people who are sneaky. In other words, people will say, you'll go to the person, hey, Tom, did you leave the... Oh, I did. You didn't notice? I did in the beginning. I did it already. I already covered it. Really, you didn't. Is there any way to hold him accountable? We can't hold you accountable because maybe you really did when we weren't looking. So that's why they wanted it to be. They wanted accountability. You can't fool around with the system because we can tell whether you left it or not if you left it at the end of your field. That's where you're expected to leave it. Otherwise, it's impossible to know if you really fulfilled the mitzvah or not, and you could lie and say you did. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Difa. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Difa said that Rav Huna said, "Ner sheish la shtei piyot, shnei piyot, ola leshnei bnei adam." That if you have a candle that has two mouths, it counts for two people. What that means is that what they used to do was they would have a bowl of oil and they would have a cover over the oil, and the wick would protrude. There would be holes in the covering from which the wick would protrude. So you could actually have two wicks coming out of the same candle. They're sharing the same pool of oil. They're drawing from the same oil, but they're making two flames. So the chidush here is, the novel point here is that we go by the number of flames, not by the number of oil jars. So even though these wicks are using the same oil, there are two flames, so it counts as two candles. Amar Rava says, Milei kara shemen v'kifa petilot, kafala alea keli, ole lekama bnei adam. Lo kafa alea keli, asa kimin medura, v'afilu le'echad nami ena ola. So what he says is, that if you take basically a dish full of oil, and you put wicks around the dish, and then you put a covering over it, so that let's say there are 10 wicks protruding from the covering. They're all sharing the same dish of oil, but there are 10 wicks. It can count for 10 people.
You have to have the covering? Or?
Yeah, that's what he says. But if you didn't put the cover over it, that's what he says, then it doesn't count even for one. Because basically all you made was a bonfire. Because if you just put wicks on a plate with oil, all it's going to do is all mesh together into one big thing. It's not going to be distinct candles. It's not, so it doesn't even count as one. It's not a candle anymore. It's just a fire that you made on a plate. So that's the chidush there. Amar Rav Rava says, Pshita li ner bayit v'ner Chanukah. It's obvious to me that if you have ner beto, the Shabbat candle, and the ner Chanukah and the Chanukah candle, that ner beto adif mishum shalom beto. That the Shabbat candle is more important because of shalom bayit. Because in those days they relied on the Shabbat candle for light in the house. And you can't benefit from the Chanukah candle. So if you don't have your Shabbat candle, you don't have any light. And people are going to be bumping into things. They're going to be cursing each other. They're going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be terrible. There's not going to be peace in the home. So therefore, we would prefer, if you could only afford oil for one candle, you go with the Shabbat candle. Now, whether that would apply today is a good question, because now we have electric lights. Ner beto v'kidush hayom. If it's a conflict between the Shabbat candle and the Kiddush wine, you can only afford one. And remember, in those days, oil was actually much more expensive than wine. Much more. Ner beto adif. Again, we say that the Shabbat candle is more important, mishum shalom beto, for the same reason. And also, you can say Kiddush and bread. You don't need to have the wine. But Rava asked, Ner Chanukah v'Kiddush Hayom. What about a conflict? You can only afford either oil for the Chanukah or Kiddush Hayom, or wine for Kiddush. Mahu. So what do we say? Kiddush Hayom adif the tadir. Do we say that the Kiddush is more important because it's more frequent? And we say tadir v'sheno tadir. Tadir kodem, that whenever you have something which is more frequent and less frequent, we always give precedence to the more frequent. And what happens more often, Shabbat or Chanukah? Obviously Shabbat happens more often than Chanukah. Or do we say, O dilma ner Chanukah adif mishum parsomei nisa? Or do we say that really ner Chanukah should take precedence because of publicizing of the miracle? And because even though it's more uncommon of a mitzvah, it still has a greater meaning to it because of publicizing the miracle. So later on, Rava concluded his question. He reached a resolution that the Chanukah candle is the more significant one. In that case, if you have a conflict between Kiddush even though it's a more frequent mitzvah, and generally we give precedence to more frequent mitzvot, because Ner Chanukah is for Pirsum Hanes, it's to publicize the miracle. It has a greater function of Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name in the world, and therefore it takes precedence in that case. Amar Rav Huna says, Haragil Baner, somebody who is careful about the candle, and this is referring, according to Rashi, both to Shabbat candles and Ner Chanukah, to both of them. Havyan le banim Talmidei Chachamim, his children will be Talmidei Chachamim, they will be scholars of Torah. There's a clear reason for this, because Rashi brings Dechtiv ki ner mitzvah v'Torah or, because the candle is a mitzvah, and the Torah is light. Al yeden ner mitzvah, Rashi says, through the candle of the mitzvah, the Shabbat v'Chanukah, ba or the Torah, comes the light of Torah. And we can understand this also on in terms of how it works. We can understand the mechanism of this, because what does the Ner Chanukah represent? It represents our thankfulness to God for preserving the Torah. Because what were the Greeks trying to destroy? They were trying to destroy the Torah. They were trying to destroy the mitzvot. And by showing you're grateful, how grateful you are, you're so careful about doing the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, it shows how much you appreciate the Torah, how much you appreciate what it stands for, and the miracle of Chanukah. That's going to be conveyed to your children. They're going to appreciate it too. They're going to become Talmidei Chachamim. Similarly, what is the whole point of the Ner Shabbat? Is to create an atmosphere on Shabbat where Torah learning can happen, where there can be, where the mitzvot can be done, and this is going to inspire the children again to become Talmidei Chachamim. Hazayir b'mezuzah, one who's careful about the mezuzah, zocheh lediran na'ah, he's going to be fortunate enough to have a beautiful home, because since he understands that his home is a vehicle for serving God, which is what the mezuzah represents, therefore he's going to have a nice home. Hazayir b'tzitzit, somebody who wears tzitzit carefully, zocheh letalit na'ah, he's going to have a nice garment, because again, he uses his garment as a mitzvah. He uses his garment to serve God, so God is going to give him the nicest garment. Hazayir b'kiddush hayom, somebody who's careful about kiddush, zocheh u'mimaleh gavrei yain, he's going to have tons of barrels of wine. Why? Because he's not using his wine to get drunk and party. He's using his wine for a mitzvah, to honor Shabbat. Rav Huna hava ragil tavachalif v'tanei pitcha de Rabbi Avin nagara. That it says Rav Huna would very frequently pass by and study by the home of Rav Avin Nagara. Chazad havaragil b'shragei tuvah. He saw that he was very careful to have candles, very large or very nice or very numerous candles. It's not exactly clear what the specific quality of the candles was that was so good, but it sounds like he had very nice quality candles, or many of them. So Amar Tzurei Gavrei Rav Reve Nafke Mehacha. He said, 2 great people are going to come from here. That's what Rav Huna said about the family. Nafke minayo Rav Idi Baravin v'Rav Chia Baravin. So Rav Idi Baravin and Rav Chia Baravin that are mentioned in the Talmud, their father was very careful about having nice Shabbat candles. And since they were very careful about that, they had 2 Talmidei Chachamim. Rav Chizda Baragel Davachalif v'Tanei Apitcha de Ben Ashad Rav Shizvi. It says that Rav Chizda would pass by and study at the home of the family of Rav Shizvi. Chazad Baragel b'Shragei Tuvah. Again, he saw that he was very careful about making sure that the candles were proper for Shabbat. Amar Gavar Rabba Nafik Mehacha. He said, "There's going to be a great man who comes from here." Nafik Minayu Rav Shizvi. That's why Rav Shizvi was emerged from that family, because his family was so careful about Shabbat candles. Devitu de Rav Yosef havat me'acharau madleketla. The wife of Rav Yosef used to light Shabbat candles right before Shabbat. Cutting it very close. Amar Rav Yosef said, Tanya, we learned in a Braita, Lo yamishem mud ha'anan yomam v'mud ha'ish laila. It says that the pillar of cloud during the day and the pillar of the fire at night never left. Melamed shamud hanan mashlim la'amud ha'esh v'amud ha'esh mashlim la'amud ha'anan. What that means was that the cloud would be there during the day and then the fire would come. So how did the transition work? So he says that the cloud would stay until the fire was there, and then the fire would leave. Okay, but then the cloud would leave, right? And then the fire would be there. And then when the cloud would come back for the daytime, the fire would stay there until the cloud came. And once the cloud was there, only then would the fire leave. So they changed the guard, but there was a moment where they were both together. In other words, what he's saying is they didn't cut it close. It wasn't that the second that the cloud would disappear and then the fire would come. Or the second the fire would come and then immediately after that the cloud would come. There was a gradual transition. So he's saying in the same way, don't cut it so close that it's like a hair's breadth between when you're lighting the candle and when Shabbat's starting. Make it a transition that you bring the candle first, and only then Shabbat comes. Just like the Amud Ha'esh would come, the fire would come in the evenings, and only then the cloud would leave.
I thought it said that she did that.
No, she was too close. She was cutting it too close.
Yes. Oh, but
there wasn't a transition.
I thought he was lauding her. He wasn't.
No. He was saying no.
That was
you should there should be a gradual transition. Sure. You should have your fire, and then the cloud will come.
That's what we do with the 18 minutes.
Right. That's why you should have a little bit of a gradual process there. So what happened then? So then Safra Lakduma, she thought, oh, then I should make it really early. I'll light the candle really early, so there's a nice period of transition. So then Amar Lahahu Sabah, a certain elder said to her, and sometimes it says that this elder might have been, some special person, like Eliyahu Navi or somebody like that. Said to her, Tanina, we learned that you shouldn't make it too early or too late. You have to be just right. So and Rashi explains, you don't want to make it too early because there's no connection between your lighting and Shabbat. There needs to be a connection between the lighting and Shabbat, but on the other hand, you don't want it to be so close that there's no sense of a gradual transition from weekday activity into Shabbat, with the candle representing weekday activity coming to a close and then Shabbat beginning. Amar Rava says, "Derachim Rabbanan havulu le Rabbanin Rabbanan." Somebody who loves the rabbis will have children who are rabbis. And the Vilna Gaon changes this. He switches this around and says that instead of Dimokir Rabbanan, instead of one who honors the rabbis, it should say here, Didachil me Rabbanan, one who fears the rabbis. Havulei Chatnavta Rabbanan. He will have sons-in-law who are rabbis. In other words, somebody who has reverence for them. So somebody who loves them, his own children will be rabbis. Somebody who has reverence for them, his sons-in-law will be rabbis. And then instead, the Gra has here, instead of Didachil me Rabbanan, that it should be Dimokir Rabbanan, one who honors the rabbis. That's more of a positive admiration. There, hu gufei habetzur v'mirabanan. He himself is a student of the rabbis. Ve'ilav bar hachihu. And if he's not somebody with the ability to be one of the rabbis himself or one of the rabbinical students himself, mishtama'an mileketzur v'mirabanan. His words will be accorded the same weight as one of the students of the rabbis. So there are three levels: somebody who loves rabbis, somebody who has reverence for them, and somebody who really values and appreciates and admires them. And so each one will have a different result. For Lo B'Shemen Serifah, it says that you can't use Shemen Serifah. You can't use the oil of burning on Shabbat, for Shabbat candles. What is the oil of burning? What does that mean? My Shemen Serifah. Amar Rabba Rabba says, Shemen Shel Tirumah, She Nitme'ah. That this is talking about oil of terumah. The term shemen serifah means oil of terumah, oil that was for the kohen, was given to the kohen, but it became tameh. The rule is that terumah tame'ah, if you have impure terumah, it has to be burnt. The kohen is allowed to burn it and use the light, but he has to burn it. So v'amai karula shemen serifah. Why do they call it burnt oil or burning oil? Ho'il v'la serifah omed, because it is set for being burnt. In other words, it's set up to be burnt because the only thing he can do, he can't use it for food anymore. If it becomes tameh, he can't use it for food, he can only burn it. U'b'shabbat mai ta'amalo. What's the reason why he can't use it for Shabbat candles? Mitoch shemitzvah lav leva'aro. Because since it's a mitzvah to burn it, gizera sheva yateh, we're worried that if it doesn't burn well enough, he might tilt the lamp to facilitate the burning a little quicker. He sees that it's going to leave a residue. It's not going to completely burn. He wants to burn the rest. He's going to tilt it. Amar le Abaye. Abaye said to him, but if that's the case, b'Yom Tov lishtereh, why don't we allow it on Yom Tov? Because on Yom Tov you're allowed to burn a candle. You're allowed to tilt a candle. So why can't he burn it on Yom Tov? Alamatnan, why did we learn in the Mishnah, also in this parak of Bameh Madlikin, Ein Madlikin b'Shemen Serifah b'Yom Tov. We read this every Friday, that you can't use Shemen Serifah, not only on Erev Shabbat it says, but on Yom Tov you can't use it, which means that it can't be a concern about tilting the lamp. Tilting the lamp you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. So he says, Gezerah Yom Tov Atu Shabbat. It's a Gezerah, that if you use it on Yom Tov, you'll come to use it on Shabbat. And if you use it on Shabbat, you might tilt it. Rav Chisda says, we are not really worried here that the person is going to tilt the lamp. That is not the reason. What's the reason? Rather, what we're talking about here, in both Mishnayot, the Mishnah that says you can't use Shemen Serifah for the Shabbat candles, and the one that says that you can't use it on Yom Tov, is the same thing. We're talking about a Friday, which is a Shabbat, which is a Yom Tov. So when it says you can't use it on Yom Tov, that's true. And when it says you can't use it on Friday, that's only a Friday that is also a Yom Tov. So then what's the reason? Because you're not allowed to burn korbanot or terumah that become tameh on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do that burning process on Yom Tov because the purpose is destruction. It's not for the purpose of Yom Tov enjoyment. It's for destruction. So since you're not allowed to burn terumah on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to use it as a Yom Tov candle, and then you can't use it on a Friday, which is a Yom Tov. But if it's really talking about a Friday that's a Yom Tov, we have another problem. But wait a second. In the first Mishnah it said you can't use it for Friday. Then it says you can't burn it on Yom Tov. It sounds like two different cases. Not that it's the same case, that they're both talking about Yom Tov. So how can you say that? So Amar Rabbi Chanina, Misura, Rabbi Chanina Misura says, Ma ta'am ka'amar. It's explaining itself. Ma ta'am in madikin b'shemen srefa b'yom tov, lefi she'en sorfin kodashim b'yom tov. What's the reason why you can't use shemen srefa? Now here, the first word b'yom tov should definitely not be there, because it doesn't make any sense. What it means is, Ma ta'am in madikin b'shemen srefa. What's the reason why you can't use shemen srefa? This condemned oil on Erev Shabbat. The reason is because you can't burn holy things on Yom Tov, meaning that you can only not use this shemen on an Erev Shabbat, which is a Yom Tov. So when it says later on in the Mishnah that you can't use this type of oil on Yom Tov, it's explaining why you can't use it for a Friday that's a Yom Tov.
You are allowed to destroy condemned oil
on Shabbat, because you start before. That's why. Because you're not actually doing the lighting on Shabbat. So now we just conclude this piece. It says, Tanya Kivatei de Rav Chizda, that there's a Braita that supports Rav Chizda that says, Kol elu shamru ein madikin ben b'Shabbat, madikin ben b'Yom Tov. Any of the things that it says that you can't use for Shabbat candles, you can use for Yom Tov. Chutz mishemen srefa lefi she'en sorfin kodashim b'Yom Tov, except for burnt oil, meaning the oil that's condemned to be burned, that you cannot use it on Yom Tov because you can't burn holy things on Yom Tov. So therefore, the reasoning is the basis for the prohibition for using shemen serefa, for using the oil of terumah for burning on Erev Shabbat is only a halacha of Yom Tov. That you're not allowed to burn it on Yom Tov because you're not allowed to destroy terumah on Yom Tov. So therefore, on a Friday that is a Yom Tov, you can't use it. But if it were an ordinary Friday, according to Rav Chizda, you would be allowed to use it, and that is the conclusion of the Gemara. Have a great day.